And there we go. We are live yet again. I'm just going to take a second here and share the video feed to the Facebook community. And we're also live on YouTube. So give me just a second as I look and get to that point where I can share that. There's always so many buttons to press and all of that. So give me just a sec. And we're diving in yet again to our weekly series on spiritual living. And as I was saying last week, we're starting this series. Just been thinking through over the last, in my brain, thinking through it the last 15 years. What does it mean to be a spiritual person, and how do we live as spiritual people? And I think that's the kind of the constant struggle of humanity. In a broader sense, what does it mean to discover purpose, mission, value? What does it mean to discover ourselves? And that is that's the pursuit of humankind, discovering ourselves, and we've completely lost sight of what it means and who we are. And that's the story of the Bible, is losing sight of who we are and our inability to find it. That probably, in the losing sight of who we are, our inability to find it, that sums up the Old Testament in a nutshell. And so, last week I talked all about what the purpose of this series is. So we went a little longer than we normally would. And this week, hopefully we're going to keep these to half an hour or so. Great to see you, Jim. It's a chilly morning from Missouri. So what's chilly for you, Jim? What's a good chilly temperature for you? Because remember, I'm in Eastern Canada, although it's a bright, sunny day out. And I'm going to guess that being from California here, just a window into the way that Josh's mind thinks, or maybe any Californian that grew up on the coast of California, at least. If it's sunny out, it is warm. The only thing that gives me pause with that is when there's snow on the ground and it's sunny, which kind of, my brain goes, what? 25 or so years of, if it was sunny out, I could pretty much assume it was going to be warm. And so if it's sunny out, you're basically shorts, t-shirt, maybe a sweater, flip-flops. And I learned in Canada that you can't trust the same senses. So here it's nice and sunny. There's a few scant clouds in the sky, and I'm going to guess it's probably 40 degrees or so for the Americans here, probably 4 or 5 degrees for the Canadians, 3, 4, 5 degrees, something like that. So Jim, 55, yeah, that could be a little chilly. So great, Jim, great to see you on. Anybody, as you're tuning in, please give the video a like, give it a share to let people know that we're going live. We're going live once a week, and we're working through, we're going to eventually get to looking at each particular discipline, or I like to call them the rhythms of the spiritual life. It's not so much, discipline is study as a discipline, right? I enact certain time frames because I know it's good for me. Rhythm is a way that I live my life to direct it in a particular, you could say music has a rhythm, or even a river would have a rhythm of its movement. And so we're talking about directing the life towards something. And so I like the term, the rhythms of the spiritual life. I like to think of them as rhythms, as more than a discipline I institute in my life. And because you institute a discipline because you're unruly in other ways, I I practice a rhythm because I want to be carried along towards something. And so that's what we call them, the rhythms of the spiritual life. Rhythms like solitude, rhythms like silence, rhythms like worship, rhythms like simplicity, rhythms like the remembrance of God, rhythms like, because we go back to the Desert Fathers, we like drawing inspiration from them. Rhythms like the remembrance of death. That's a good one for all you morbid ones out there. And so we're going to eventually get to there. But what I want to do in these first few episodes is to lay the groundwork for what it means to be human. We talked a lot about this last week, and what it means to be a spiritual being, and to hope to dispel some of the common misconceptions and to give you a good basis to draw on what it means to be you, if we're talking about what it means to be human. So great to see Denvel. Wonderful to see you. If you can give the video a like, share the video. I know I'm asking a lot. That's kind of like, you have to be a bit prophetic to like the video before we're even finished with it, because you don't know what you're going to get. But just letting people know that we're live and in support of what we do. And so our goal in all that we do with Wind Ministries is to give you resources to live a God-directed life. And we do that with podcasts, we do that with courses, we do that with books, we do that with personal mentorship, we do that with devotionals, we do that with um, conferences and seminars, and we do that with leadership development and training. We do that with inner healing prayer and pastoral counseling sessions, this kind of stuff. That's our goal, to one, give you resources to direct your life to God, and two, help you discover what has hindered you from directing your life to God. And so that's what we're doing this series, a spiritual living series, to help you direct your life towards God. Because what greater call in life is there than to live a life that is God directed? And not so much just thinking about him, but living a life with him in mind, and becoming like him in mind. And that we talked a little bit last week about the vocation of humanity, and we'll talk more about that this week as well. So we're going to dive into some things as well. So my name is Joshua Hoffert, for those of you that are just tuning in, and we run Wind Ministries. And as I said, Wind Ministry exists to equip you to experience him. And it's in all its form, in every form that we can. And we have our own limits, of course, and but that's what we do. So great to see V Yates. I'm gonna guess that's still Denvel over on YouTube. So wonderful to see everybody just jumping in. So we're live on the Facebook and on YouTube, and we're going to be talking today about we looked at Adam last week in terms of looking at what it means to be human, and that Adam was the initiation of the human project, right? When we look at the language of saying that says God created man, he made man in his own image. That term for made means he initiated a project. Thinking of a piece of art, when you set out to make a piece of art, you're not finished with the first stroke. You have an end result in mind, and the end result in God's mind, when it came to Adam, it's not even heavily implied. It's just directly stated that the end result was going to be Jesus, and we're going to look at that. So, what does it mean to be human? What it means to be human isn't to recapture our innocence like Adam and Eve, although that is a lofty ambition and a lofty goal and a good place to start. But what it means to be human is to look at the person of Jesus, because Jesus presents what it means to be fully human. And by presenting what it means to be fully human, it also presents what it means to be fully spiritual. And so we'll talk through those kind of things, because what we want to do is set our goal straight in that sense. Because sometimes what happens, especially in my experience within the charismatic circles that I grew up with, and then having broadened to Pentecostal, Orthodox, Catholic, Anglican, and looking at all of those kind of things, What happens is our goal of why we institute disciplines or rhythms is, and in the sense of living a spiritual life or becoming spiritual, is we get the destination very wrong, and then we misapply the practices. And so the practices come in and we go, well, this is where, so like for instance, in the kind of typical spiritual formation com- group of people teaching, there's, you kind of catch this constant refrain that the end goal of spiritual living is to be non-anxious, so that I no longer have anxiety, and I no longer have fear. And this, the thing with that is that that's not the goal, that's the byproduct. And so, but you'll find that language a lot when you listen to people talking about spiritual formation is, well, if you do these things, you'll no longer be anxious. If you do these things, you'll no longer live a life of fear. That's true. I'm not saying that's not true. And I don't disagree with the authors I'm thinking of and the speakers I'm thinking of. I have a lot of great respect for people in the spiritual formation community or in the spiritual formation crowd. But sometimes what we do is we sell, the selling point is the ancillary effects and not the actual life and the actual goal. And that becomes problematic because what we anticipate is, if we anticipate the thing that we don't get, then we'll be disappointed in our anticipation. And so if our anticipation is a lack of anxiety, and then we still have anxiety in 20 years, and we've been practicing the spiritual rhythms, and we're like, well, I still have anxiety. Why? Because it hasn't completely gone away. Um, well, what's wrong with me? Well, that's the goal is not being non-anxious. The goal is something different. And that's just one of the Jesus said this in Matthew 7, Matthew 6, at the very end of Matthew 6. Really audacious words when he says, "Be anxious for nothing." Um, and like, when you think about that, like, people that are largely anxious, humanity in general, right? Proverbs dedicates a decent portion of the writings to dealing with anxiety in the human heart. Um, so we know humanity has a problem with anxiety, and Jesus goes, "Be anxious for nothing, right? But in all things." Or Paul says this also, right? But for any, so Jesus, be anxious for nothing, and then talking about the lilies of the field, talking about the birds of the air, and he says, "Seek first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added to you." That's the last kind of passage in Matthew 6. This is audacious language, be anxious for nothing. When, well, but Jesus, I'm anxious all the time. So, but Jesus is anchoring the dissipation of anxiety not in trying to not become anxious, but in trusting the Father. So how do we, so the question then is peeled back even a step further, which Jesus talks about this earlier in the Beatitudes or in the Sermon on the Mount, is how do I live a life that increases trust in the Father? So how do I direct my life? How do I live a God directed life? How does my life flow more towards him? Um, and this is what decreases anxiety, not do these disciplines and these rhythms, and anxiety will lessen in your life. That's just the wrong selling point. Um, and or fear for that matter, or lust for that matter, or pride. And sometimes we sell the side benefits rather than the actual journey to people. Selling in the sense of setting a thing that you should aim for is what I mean by that. And so what does it mean? What does it mean to be human? And so again, we looked at Adam. We see Adam in Genesis 2 specifically given a that Adam is called good, very good. Actually, creation, once Adam is in it, is called, or once humanity is in it. We don't see the creation of Adam until Genesis 2. Genesis 1, we have a more generic, creates mankind in his image. So whatever that means. But we see that creation is very good once. Hey, Susan, it's great to see you. We see creation being called very good once Adam and Eve are there, once humanity is there, bearing the image of God into creation. And so we kind of dispelled or just drew apart Genesis 1 as a creation narrative and a creation story last week, just setting that stage. So Adam, full of wisdom, wise enough to name all the animals, to recognize distinctions. He's got some kind of gift of language. We're looking at maybe a shades of tongues, interpretation of tongues in 1 Corinthians 12. Adam speaking to the animals or communicating with the animals, understanding language. We've got prophecy when he prophesies over Eve, who comes out of his side. So we've got this. When we look at Adam, we see this a picture of a person who is on some level moved by the Spirit of God and enabled by the Spirit of God, right? Wisdom, knowledge, insight, discernment, all these things we see kind of active in the person of Adam. So the quote unquote spiritual gifts are alive and well in the person of Adam. And we can see shades of that, examples of that. But Adam isn't what it means to be human. Right, Adam is the beginning of a project. He's not the end of a project, and he messes the whole thing up. So we want to talk a bit about that today. So let's see, where do we want to? Well, we've already started, but where do we want to go? Part of what I like doing too is bringing a patristic bent to things. How did the early fathers see this, and how did they interpret this, and how do they apply this? And for that, we can look at Basil the Great. Basil the Great said this in regards to the image of God in man. He said, he's quoting Genesis 1, "Let us make the human being according to our image and according to our likeness." And Basil said this in regards to that. "By our creation, we have the first, and by our free choice, we build the second." So by nature, we are his image. By grace, we are his likeness. So there's a process. So right from the get-go, the early church fathers saw this as the image and likeness not being a static representation, but being a continuing journey of becoming like him. And that from Adam, we have the kind of first picture, when a baby is born, they need a lot of time to grow and mature. And that's kind of how they were thinking about Adam, is Adam was an immature human being who was enabled and empowered by God, but also shows the deep frailty of humanity when he falls to the devil's schemes. And so there's lots we could say about that. There's the three tests, or the three statements of Eve, and there's lots we could say this. I don't know. Maybe we should go into that, but we see these parallels. Well, let's say this. We see these parallels in the temptation of Eve in Genesis 3, where the serpent says in Genesis 3, I'm just going to go there real quick. And the temptation is, let's see, the serpent says, "You won't die. God knows that in the day you eat, your eyes will be open. You'll be like God, knowing good and evil." And the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was a delight to the eyes, it was desirable to make one wise. She took from its fruit and ate. So the question of the serpent, the three temptations of Eve are it was desirable to make one wise, it was good for food, and it was pleasing to the eye. These are the three things that Eve specifically is tempted by with the fruit. Those mirror the three temptations of Jesus. So Eve is tempted and falls to the temptation. Jesus is tempted in the wilderness at the inauguration of his vocational calling. So Eve, in the inauguration of her vocational calling, is tempted, three temptations. Jesus, at the inauguration of his vocational calling, is tempted with three temptations. Eve succumbs to the three temptations, and Jesus overcomes the three temptations. So there's where we get the project image as well, is humanity as a project fails in its application. Jesus, as the fulfillment of the project, enables humanity or overcomes those temptations, because the three things that Eve finds as tempting factors, Jesus experiences in the desert in Luke 4 when he's led into the Spirit, or led into the wilderness by the Spirit to be tempted by the devil. So these are where we get all these parallels in scripture between Adam and Eve and the picture of Jesus as what it means to be truly human. So so mankind is made in the image of God, given every um given all. It says, Basil the Great said this. We'll just say it. We'll quote this. He says, "First, the power to rule was conferred on you, O human. You are a ruling being." So this is Adam in his Genesis. You're a ruling being. The power to rule is conferred on you, right? He's given charge over all of creation. And then Basil says this: "Why then do you serve the passions as a slave? Why do you throw away your own dignity and become a slave of sin? For what reason do you make yourself a prisoner of the devil? You were appointed ruler of creation. You've renounced the nobility of your nature." And so that's the fall, of course, is you were called as a ruler of creation, and you've renounced. I love that language. As devastating as it is, you've renounced the nobility of your nature. So when we look at um, let's see, I'm just looking at some quotes here. There's a great one of the desert fathers named Dorotheus of Gaza, laid out the process of what happened here, that mankind was given this privileged place and then falls from his natural state. It says this: since he fell from his natural state and found himself in an unnatural state that is subject to sin, the love of the pleasures of this world, and to the other passions that overcame him, becoming indeed wholly enslaved to these on account of this contravention. So he disobeys God. He is taken from his natural state and in an unnatural state. So that's how the early fathers saw the ramifications of the fall, is that mankind in his natural state, we look at Adam. In his unnatural state, we see the impact of all of what the early fathers called the passions upon humanity. And the passions being things like the desire for pleasure, the desire for lust, the occasion for anger, pride, lust, greed. These kind of things are the passions. And so mankind in his natural state wasn't subject to these; they were subject to him. Mankind in his fallen state is subject to these passions. So now everything's become twisted, and we've lost that that idea of what it means to be human. And the Old Testament is the story of mankind trying to find their way back to being human and failing miserably at doing so. We can't find our way back to being human. We're really good at losing who we are. We're very good. We're not good at all at finding who we are. Um, and so, just a couple of ideas to throw out there. Isaiah of Scetis, he lays out. He's another desert father, 4th century. He lays out a number of what are the in the natural state of what's the natural usefulness of desire in the human, and what's the natural usefulness of anger in the human, what's the natural usefulness of ambition in the human. Isaiah's laying these things out. He says things like this: desire in the natural state of mind is desire for God. Without desire, no love exists. It is on account of this that Daniel is called a man of desire. So God uses that language. Desire we would look at in terms of lust for pleasure, but Isaiah is saying, but in its natural state, desire is not an evil thing. Desire is actually a good thing. Desire is a thing that creates love for God. And so desire in its natural state is the desire to be pleasing to God, the desire to pursue God. What happens is that lust takes desire and twists it and makes people insane with desire. And so this is the unnatural state of humanity. So in its natural state, desire is a good and godly thing. In its unnatural state, it's twisted, and desire now, rather than being moved towards desire for God, desire is moved towards my own gratification and fulfillment. And so in its unnatural state, it twists itself back on us. So we see that in the temptation of Eve. Every temptation was how this impacts me. In the temptation of Jesus, the way Jesus combated this is he had no thought for himself, because he goes, are you if you're hungry, make this stone bread. And Jesus, rather than turning it on himself and saying, well, I am hungry, right? It's desirable for food. He goes, God can feed me. So every temptation with Eve was turned on herself. Every way that Jesus overcame the temptation was to turn them away from himself. And so desire is this is or the passions are the natural state of humanity caved in on itself, and then man cannibalizes himself and cannibalizes others to build himself up. That's what pride does, is it takes what other people have, namely their humanity and their um, their dignity, and says, that's less than me and I'm better than that, so I've cannibalized that person's dignity to make myself more dignified. And that is what sin does. Sin cannibalizes ourselves and others in order to feed this unending, this insatiable need within us. And that's why we can't find ourselves again, because we've so fallen. So you're given the power to rule. You've lost your natural state. The natural state is desire for God. The unnatural state is lust and desire for pleasure. The natural state is ambition for godliness. The unnatural state is ambition for your own personal gain. And actually, Isaiah says the natural use of anger is the power to overcome unrighteousness, that be angry at all things that would cause you to sin. And the unnatural state, of course, is anger towards your fellow humans and to lash out at them. So there's a natural state of humanity and an unnatural state of humanity. Um, so that in the early fathers, the purpose of the law was to give man a means of returning to himself. And Dorotheus says this: God, who is good, gave the law as an aid to the return of man and to rectify evil, even though evil was not set aright. So evil was still ruling and reigning, but God gave mankind the law in order to return to himself, in order to find himself again. Oh, this is what I'm starting to see. This is what it means to be human, right? The law is not the fulfillment of humanity's maturity, because Jesus shows us that very clearly in Matthew 5, that you've heard it was said this, but the fulfillment of that is this. The law was kind of like, if you think of kids, you give kids the rules of the house. This is, if you do these things, it's going to go better for you, right? But this isn't the picture of, like if I say to my kids, don't we have a 2-year-old chocolate lab. Um, don't treat the dog this way. He's going to get hyper and excited, and he's going to break things in the house, right? This isn't the picture of maturity. This is just saying, if you don't do these things, right? Don't jump on the dog. Don't throw things across the room for him. Don't try and lay on top of him and wrestle with him. Those are all don't. Those don't produce maturity. They just produce an environment that's not ruled by chaos, so that we can hope to kind of recover what it means to be a family, and that we're not trying to constantly mitigate the disaster of the dog wagging his tail everywhere. So I put rules in place not to produce maturity. I put rules in place to dispel chaos, so that we can actually become the kind of people that we're created to become. So this is where Dorotheus is saying, is that the law was given so that mankind can recover himself. Not that we'd be able to mature through the law, but that we would actually be able to set some parameters for what it means to be in community and relationship and all of that. I mean, simply put, that the part of the problem with understanding the law in the Old Testament too, from a 21st century Judeo-Christian westernized society, is that people were completely unhinged in that time of world history. The kind of uh, immoral decadence that cultures practice was absolutely evil. I mean, you're talking about, like it's almost unheard of today to have child sacrifice, but it was not uncommon then, or even human sacrifice, but it was not uncommon then. So the kind of things that God's dealing with in terms of a human level at the point of putting the law in place were not weren't like, oh, we're not talking about a matured moral outlook, governed by a Western society that largely agrees stealing is bad. Like I've said, I think I said it in the last episode too, is that most people that have grown up in this world could sneeze and fulfill at least 7 of the 10 commandments without even thinking about it. in the Old Testament, these are revolutionary for humanity. And there's a few different, Hammurabi's code was another very similar rule of law that that the Ten Commandments lays out. There's a few other ones as well that exist in the ancient world. These are revolutionary for moral integrity, and today they're just kind of the base level of what it means to try and live in society. So we're not talking about a matured human ethic there in the Old Testament. We're talking about the law being given to set the stage so that chaos doesn't rule and reign over the earth. Um, and this is important as we're getting to what it means to be human, is not the picture of Adam in the garden, because that's the picture of immature humanity. The picture of what it means to be human we see in Jesus. So mankind lost themselves. God gives them a law to try and establish at least some decorum in humanity, and not maturity in humanity, because that was a long way off. Mankind was subject to his own pleasures, to his own wants. Um, so um, let's say, where are we going to go from here? I'll say this: when we look at Genesis 3 and the direct ramification of the fall in terms of Adam and Eve, um, you've got the implications of the curse towards the serpent. You've got the implication of the land no longer yielding itself to Adam. You've got the implication of childbirth and desire for the woman, right? All the things that are said. There's a couple things to note there that I love that we have to look at when Adam and Eve fall. Again, because we're seeing Genesis present the picture of a good, kind, and wise father as a creator, juxtaposed over, I talked about this last week, over against a chaotic creation story that's full of infighting amongst the gods. So we're seeing a very different picture here in Genesis. And when Adam and Eve desecrate God's creation, the first thing that happens is not that God shows up and goes, "Get out of here," is that God shows up and says, "Where are you?" So he invites Adam and Eve into a place of reconciliation. So this is again showing the difference. And Moses, in writing Genesis 1, 2, and 3, is showing the enormous difference between what it means for the Jewish nation, or Israel nation, to be the people of God, over against, largely what he's combating when he writes it is what the mythos of creation in ancient Egypt. And so he's going, look, this God, he didn't kick them right out. He went to them and said, "Come and let's talk about this. Where are you?" Right? An invitation to a conversation, reconciliation, and Adam hides himself. The early church fathers posed the question as, what would have happened if Adam would have come and repented and said, "I'm so sorry, I've done this wrong"? What would the response of God be? Because he doesn't come in anger. He comes in relational movement towards Adam. Where are you? And it's not until Adam makes all of his excuses and then Eve makes all of her excuses that that the consequences come down. But he invites them to relationship. So what happens if Adam and Eve go, "We've messed up royally, God, will you forgive us?" We have a different story there. But unfortunately, that's not what happens. And as if in terms of a story that captures the problem with humanity and what we all struggle with, is shame, hiding ourselves, and being unwilling to come to grips with who we are and what's happened to us. And so this kind of, the Adam and Eve story embodies that as well. The prototypical humankind, the prototypical problems with humanity, and the lengths God would go to rectify that and to empower and enable humanity. So we see the picture of a good, loving, tender father coming to his people, them rejecting him, which is the story of all of the Old Testament, right? God comes in Moses, he comes onto the mountain, and the people are terrified that God's going to kill them. So we've got the picture of God coming to give form and instruction, and to give empowerment and enablement, to be a blessing, all this stuff, and the people of God constantly rejecting him throughout the whole Old Testament. It starts with Adam and Eve, and it keeps going, and it culminates in Jesus, but you finally have people that welcome Jesus, whereas you have largely Jesus is rejected except for the 12. when he hides himself away, but you finally have a people that will welcome him, and it starts with 12 disciples, just like God wanted to start with 12 tribes. So I mean, there's all these parallels, right? That's just layer after layer after layer after layer after layer. So what we see this, I want to quote this, Romans 5:14. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those. Great to see you, Berta. V Yates, it's wonderful to have you. I've been on. So sorry to see you run, but you can always tune back in on the recording. So Romans 5:14. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those who had not sinned, according to the likeness of the transgression of Adam, who is a type of him who was to come. So this is an important verse when we're talking about what does it mean to be human. And we're going to have to do a whole nother episode on this too, because we haven't even gotten to the bulk of what I wanted to talk about. So Adam is a type of him who was to come, meaning this: if something is a type, it is not the fulfillment. Okay, if something is a type, it is a a shadowy observation of the thing that's going to be there, right? If I've got a toy camera that I'm using to live stream with you, it's not actually a camera. It's a type. It's not the actual thing. And so Adam being a type of him who was to come means that Adam was not the fulfillment of him who was to come. Adam being the inaugural human was not the picture of what it means to be human. He's only a type. He only indicates, he only points forward to, through vague imagery, through vague intonation, right? The one who was to come. So that's an important element that we have to look at, that Adam was a type. He wasn't the fulfillment. So when we go, because sometimes what happens is when we talk about what it means to recapture, to be spiritual, to be humans, is we want to look at the garden and Adam and Eve and go, it's back to the innocence. It's back to the, walking with God in the cool of the day, all that stuff. And, that's not untrue, but Adam was only a type. He wasn't the fulfillment. Adam isn't our exemplar, or par exemplar, as you will. Jesus is. He is the fulfillment of the type. So what it means to be human is what we see when we look at Jesus. And largely, I mean, there's so much to say about that. Largely what we look at, let's see, two things. What we look at when we see Jesus, lots to say about this, right? Jesus, when he says he's the truth, we'll talk about this in our next stream because we're going to wind this to a close in a couple minutes. Jesus as the truth. And I want to look at, actually, throw you guys for a loop, look at Job 7 as in one sense. But what we have to come to grips with when we see Jesus as the type of what it means to be human is that when Jesus is betrayed in the garden by Judas in Matthew 26 or Matthew 27, no, Matthew 26, when he's betrayed by Jesus in Matthew 26, Jesus says to Judas, "Friend, why have you come?" Knowing, obviously he knows Judas has betrayed him because he's already talked about Judas betraying him. But he calls him friend and fellow worker. He calls him. So Jesus, in the midst of betrayal, didn't look at Judas and say, "Get away from me." In the midst of betrayal, Jesus calls him friend. Jesus doesn't push Judas away. And in fact, where Peter strikes the ear of the high priest, we find that in John, that we know that Peter did it. Matthew just says one of the disciples did it. That Jesus, rather than rebuking the servant of the high priest, he heals him and rebukes Peter. So we see that in Jesus, and so Jesus doesn't reject the betrayer, and then Jesus on the cross, he doesn't reject the two men who were there with him on the cross. So both those examples show that the entire content of the being of Christ is love to the very end. And so that shows us the picture of what it means to be human perfectly. And Jesus encapsulates when he says, and that's in practice, right? Everything Jesus taught, he actually practiced as well. We see love right to the end. And Jesus says, they'll know they will know that you're my disciples by your love. So the content of his being is love right to the end, never once walking away from that place of true and pure love, being willing to lay his life down for others, not considering his own agenda, not considering his own purpose, all of those things. His purpose was to pour and meter out love onto humanity. And so that kind of gives us our snapshot of what it means to be human. And Jesus is in the midst of great betrayal, in the midst of great suffering. It looks like trust in the Father. It looks like love for those who have hurt you, and it looks like turning, in the language of Jesus, turning the other cheek when people strike you. So so that is it in practice. And then when we look at the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus gives us the picture of what a human actually looks like. And every point of emphasis of Jesus in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, the sermon, which is presented as the kingdom vision of Jesus for a human being, is Jesus. It's the picture of him, right? It's who he is. Oh, this is my prayer life, right? What does it mean to pray? Well, here's the Lord's Prayer. We call it even the Lord's Prayer because he prayed it. Um, and so Jesus presents this picture of what it means to be human by his own example. And when we look at Jesus, we see this is what it means to be, and then what it means to be human. And then because Jesus is fully God, we go, this also shows us what it means to be spiritual. So to be spiritual doesn't mean to anticipate some kind of spiritual life in the heavens where we're in clouds playing harps. It doesn't mean having dreams and visions and strange esoteric spiritual events. That's not what it means to be spiritual. In fact, we don't even see any that. I mean, probably the best you can say is the transfiguration, but we don't even see a dream or a vision that Jesus had. We don't even know any of them that he had. That doesn't make him less or more spiritual. We're going to assume that he had dreams and maybe visions. I don't know. It doesn't say specifically. It doesn't mean being able to have heavenly experiences or escaping the being able to escape the body of flesh and be in the spirit. That's not what it means. It doesn't mean to be overcome all of the emotions that you would ever feel, and to be kind of, in the ancient philosophical language, be stoically unemotional. That's not the picture of what it means to be spiritual or to be human. Jesus was very emotional, and Jesus was very spiritual. And so what we see when we investigate Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is we have this picture painted to us of what God is like, but also what humanity is supposed to be like. And it gives us an entirely different frame of reference. And so I'll say this is the last thing I want to say, and we will wrap this up with this. Is in Job, there's a great verse that anticipates the whole redemptive arc of the New Testament, and it's Job 7, and it says this. There's verses 17 to 7, I think it's 17 and 18. So I'm just turning in my Bible there. Job 7, it says, "What is man that you would magnify him, or that you would exalt him, and that you are concerned about him?" Or the New King James says, "What is man that you would magnify him, and that you would set your heart upon him? That you would examine him every morning and try him every moment." And verse 19, it says, "Will you ever turn your gaze from me, or let me alone until I swallow my spittle? Have I sinned? What have I done to thee? O watcher of men, you've set your target on me." So 17, 18, and 19, and 20. So what I want to point out is that Job says, God has set his target on me. He set his target on humanity. And what that means is that he visits man. He intends to expand man. Why do you magnify man? Why do you expand? Word means to be expanded. Why do you magnify and expand man? You've set your heart upon him. You've set your target upon him. So this means that God has set his sights on humanity in order to increase humanity, and in order to make his nature known through humanity. He set his heart upon humankind. And so every individual human, God, especially, that there are those who have rejected him, but those who walk with him, God has set his target upon you. The reason he has set his target upon you is so that he can increase you. The reason that he would increase you is so that he would set his nature within you. The reason he would set his nature within you is that so people would see him through you. So this has been the story from the beginning. Job says this, Job being probably the earliest book written, possibly the earliest book written. Actually, it's been hypothesized the earliest book written or the latest book written. So who knows? But God sets his sight on humanity in order to give his nature to humanity, in order that humanity would look like him, so that mankind would be expanded and that God would be seen through the human vocation. So the vocation of humanity is to bear the likeness, bear the image of God and walk in his likeness. We completely twisted itself at the fall through humankind's inclination to serve their own needs, and it finds its fulfillment in the person of Jesus, who we see in the person of Jesus. The 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 entirety of his being was pure love. um and he lived that way, and he taught that way, and he lived that way. What he taught, he also lived. Hard pressed to find a human teacher who also lives all the things that he teaches. Actually, Francis Schaeffer, in his book, How Then Should We Now Live, does a great job pulling apart human teachers and showing philosophers and artists and all this, and showing how they failed to live up to their own ideal. Jesus was the only human who ever lived up to his own ideal. He taught and lived the exact same thing. And so we see the content of his being is love, and the content of his being is also purely human. He's what it means to be truly human. He's the divine fulfillment of the project, the person of Jesus. We see it in the Beatitudes. We see it in his actions. We see it at the very end when he's betrayed and he's hung on a cross, and he never stops dispensing love in his being. So being spiritual and being human is not to have strange events. It's not to have esoteric experiences. It's not to escape this world. It's not to be living in a heavenly place. It's not to be completely unemotional. It's none of those things. It's to be full of pure love right until the end of your life. That's what it means to be human. And the one of the great refrains of the early church, and you find this as early as the 2nd century, and it's really a restatement of 2 Corinthians 7, where I think it's maybe 2 Corinthians 9, something like that, where it says that he became poor, the rich one, God became poor for our sakes, that we might become rich. And so it's really a restatement of that. Yeah, Susan, we're all a work in progress. My point in all of this, by the way, before I say this, my point in all of this in response to Susan is that when we set our end goal in the right place to become pure love, then our practices actually find the fulfillment. So here's the thing. If our end goal is to become pure love and our practices are to get us there, rhythms of our life, spending silence and solitude, giving ourselves all that stuff, then we actually acquire in the practice our end goal. So we have our end goal of love, but in our practice, we actually acquire the promise. So the promise of love is realized in the practice of the spiritual life. So I'm both practicing the end and acquiring the end in the moment of all of my rhythms and all of my disciplines and all of my life. So I acquire the end in my practice and I point myself to the end. So I'll never be unfulfilled in my practice, because my practice is fulfilled, or my practice is pointed towards love, and it's fulfilled in love in the moment. So the one of the Clement of Alexandria, one of the early church fathers, said that the promise is fulfilled in the practice. The promise of love is fulfilled in the practice. You're given love in the practice. And that refrain you find a lot. But what I wanted to say is in Irenaeus of Lyon, the 2nd century early church father, an apostolic father, Irenaeus said this. He said, God became man so that man might become God. So what does that mean, right? This is not, I was watching there's a popular YouTuber that's doing a takedown on Benny Hinn and his theology, the little gods theology, that God recreates according to his kind, and so he makes little gods. And so when Irenaeus said God became man that mankind might become God, Was he saying what some of the prosperity preachers have said over the years, or was he saying something fundamentally different? He's saying something fundamentally different. And a great example of what Irenaeus meant when he said God became man so that man might become God is encapsulated in the reputation of a later desert father named Macarius the Great. It was said of Macarius that he became a god on earth because he covered the faults of others as though he never saw them. So what did it mean to become like God? It meant to dispense grace, to dispense mercy, to be to that the content of your being was divine love right till the end. That's what Irenaeus means, is that when mankind is made to reacquire the likeness of God, what he looks like is the willingness to sacrifice and the willingness to give himself, the willingness to make himself of no reputation. And so that's that ultimate fulfillment. So faith, hope, and love, the greatest of these is love. Absolutely, Susan. So you see, like trying to be in context to seeing all those things, those threads are all there in scripture, right? And so we're trying to paint the bigger narrative so you can see, how does that verse fit in there? Oh, well, that's how that verse fits in there. God's put his target on mankind in order to make his nature known through mankind and to increase mankind so that he'd be known. And what would be known is that the content of mankind's being is pure love received from the Father, who is love, right to the end. And that we're made like him. We're partakers of his divine nature. So what does that mean? We become perfectly loving people. So that's the looking at. We're going to look more at the person of Jesus as the prototypical human being. And the takeaway I want you to get from this is that the story of Christianity is not a return to the idyllic times of the garden, but it's fulfilled in the person of Jesus, what it looks like to look like a human being is seen in the perfect picture of Jesus. Looking at Adam is good. Looking at Jesus is better. Adam's only a type. He's a shadow. He points towards the thing to come. This is what it means to be human, is to look at Jesus. And so we're going to investigate a little bit more of the man Jesus and setting our sights in the right place of what it means to recover humanity. And that's the person of Jesus. So thanks everybody for tuning in. There's a couple of links in the video description. If you would like, you can find the books that we've written, devotionals that we've written. They're all available on the Wind shop. If you don't have any of those, take a look at those. You can donate to support the ministry. There's a link there. Your donations are always, of course, incredibly helpful. There's a link to the Wind Training Academy, where we have courses to help you grow in your spiritual life. And then we have some spiritual mentorship and inner healing things that are offered as well, where we walk with you and help you grow as a leader, as a lover of God, as a prophetic person, and help you develop that. And so there's links for all of that kind of stuff in the video description. If you're struggling in life and you're trying to work through some issues and you feel like you have blocks, we have people that can walk with you and help you. So please reach out to us, and we'd love to be a resource to you. So until next week, God bless. It's been fun, everybody.